Invade Earth. Have you lost your minds? Emergency Galactic Council meeting. The alarm did not wake me. I was already awake. I had been sitting at my desk for 2 hours before the red light began flashing above my door, staring at a single line of text on my terminal that I had read perhaps 40 times and still could not quite accept. 3 words. A planet name. A proposal. And underneath them, a council stamp that meant the matter was no longer theoretical. My name is Vexaal. I am the Senior Archivist of the Galactic High Council, a title that sounds far more important than it is. I have spent 312 years cataloging war declarations, peace treaties, species assessments, border disputes, and the general noise that a galaxy full of intelligent life tends to produce. I have seen civilizations rise and collapse. I have written the death notices for species that burn too bright and too fast. I have held in my hands the original surrender documents from the Krethkai-Savari War, documents so old the material they were printed on had begun to dissolve at the edges. I say all of this not to impress you, but to explain why what happened next was unusual. In 312 years, nothing had ever made my hands shake. The proposal on my screen did. The emergency session was called for the 6th bell of the morning cycle, which in practical terms meant that half the chamber would arrive tired and irritable. This was not an accident. Emergency sessions scheduled at uncomfortable hours tend to produce faster votes. Counselors who have been pulled from sleep are rarely in the mood for lengthy debate. Whoever had timed this session understood that. I arrived at the high chamber 40 minutes early and found it already half full. That was the first sign that something was genuinely wrong. Council members do not arrive early. Arriving early to a council session is considered, in most political circles, a sign of either desperation or poor social understanding. The fact that representatives from 37 species were already seated, in their uncomfortable chairs, before the 6th bell, told me more than the proposal itself had. I took my seat at the archivist's bench, a long table set slightly below and to the left of the main floor, positioned so that I could observe every delegation without appearing to watch any of them directly. It is an old design, built for exactly this kind of work. The Krethkai delegation sat in the center-left block, where they always sat. There were 4 of them, which was unusual. Normally they sent 2 representatives to routine sessions. For meant they were taking this seriously. The lead representative, a heavy-set individual named Vorith, was reviewing documents on a handheld screen and looking insufferably confident. I had dealt with Vorith before. He was the kind of being who believed that confidence, displayed loudly enough, could substitute for intelligence. I pulled up the proposal file on my terminal and began reading. The Krethkai Dominion was formally requesting authorization for what they were calling a resource acquisition campaign directed at a planet in the outer spiral, catalogued in our records as Sol 3, local designation Earth. The document was written in the clean, bloodless language that military bureaucracies use when they want to make something large sound small. Words like campaign instead of conquest. Acquisition instead of seizure. Integration instead of subjugation. I had translated enough of these documents to read past the language. What they were proposing was a full military operation against an inhabited world. The target species was listed as pre-galactic contact, which meant they had not yet been officially welcomed into the galactic community. In practical terms, this made them legally unprotected under 3 of the 7 major council statutes. The Krethkai had done their paperwork correctly. Whoever their legal team was, they were good. I opened the supporting intelligence file. It was the standard format: population estimate, territorial reach, known military capacity, resource value. The numbers for Earth were not remarkable. The population was large but not exceptional by galactic standards. The territorial reach was limited to a single planet and its immediate orbital space, plus some exploratory probes that had been traveling quietly through the outer system for decades. The resource value was listed as significant, particularly several rare mineral deposits that the Krethkai had apparently been eyeing for some time. The military capacity section was brief. The Krethkai intelligence team had assessed human military technology as roughly 400 years behind current galactic standard. They noted the presence of nuclear weapons with a line that I thought was almost casual in its dismissal: primitive mass destruction capability, localized threat only. They listed the total number of active military personnel, the number of naval vessels capable of reaching orbit, and the estimated response time before any coordinated resistance could be organized. The whole section was 3 paragraphs. Something about those 3 paragraphs made me stop. I had assessed threat reports for 3 centuries. I knew what they were supposed to look like. A proper threat report for an inhabited world ran to dozens of pages. It covered not just military hardware but social structure, historical patterns, psychological profiles of the species, documented responses to external pressure, cultural attitudes toward conflict. 3 paragraphs meant the Krethkai intelligence team had looked at human technology, compared it to their own, and stopped reading. That is a dangerous way to evaluate an opponent. I flagged my concern in my session notes and began scrolling back to the beginning of the file, this time reading more slowly. Not the summary. The raw data. The appendices. The small attached documents that nobody reads because they are buried at the back and written in small text. The first thing I found was a historical note. A brief one, filed almost as an afterthought by a junior analyst who had apparently done slightly more thorough research than their colleagues. It read, "Subject species maintains detailed written records of organized conflict dating back approximately 5,000 years. Conflicts are frequent and recurring. Estimated percentage of recorded history involving active large-scale conflict, approximately 93%. I read that line 3 times. 93%. I set down my stylus. I looked at the Krethkai delegation across the chamber floor. Vorith was still reviewing his documents, still looking confident. The session began on the 6th bell, exactly on schedule. The council chair, an elderly Savari named Prelin, called the room to order with a tap of her ceremonial staff. She announced the agenda. She introduced the proposal. She gave the floor to Vorith. Vorith stood and delivered a presentation that lasted 18 minutes. It was polished, confident, and almost entirely concerned with the resource value of the planet and the legal framework that permitted the operation. He spent perhaps 2 minutes on the military assessment, breezing through it with the ease of someone who considered the matter already settled. The humans had no faster-than-light travel. They had no energy weapons. They had no shielding technology. Their most advanced orbital vessels were, by Krethkai standards, barely functional. He sat down to a murmur of what I could only describe as cautious interest. Not enthusiasm. Not outrage. Cautious interest. Which in council terms meant that most of the room was not yet decided. The chair opened the floor to questions. 3 delegations asked about resource-sharing arrangements. 2 asked about legal jurisdiction. 1 asked about the timeline. Nobody asked about the 93%. I raised my hand. Prelin looked at me with mild surprise. Archivists do not typically speak during open session. We observe, we record, we advise quietly afterward. That is the role. I had followed that role without exception for over 3 centuries. Archivist Vexaal, she said, in a tone that made it clear she was granting me the floor out of courtesy and expected something brief. I have a concern regarding the intelligence assessment, I said. I would like to request 48 cycles before any vote is taken, in order to complete a full species threat evaluation. The room was quiet. Vorith looked at me the way large, confident beings often look at small, quiet ones who have interrupted them. With tolerant impatience. The intelligence file is comprehensive, he said. The intelligence file is 3 paragraphs, I said. Another silence. Longer this time. Prelin studied me for a moment. She was old enough and experienced enough to know that I would not be standing up and speaking in open session unless I had a reason. She did not know what the reason was. Neither did I, fully. Not yet. But I had read that line about 93%, and my hands were still not entirely steady, and in 312 years of work, I had learned to pay attention to the things that made my hands shake. 48 cycles, she said. The vote is postponed. Archivist Vexaal, you will submit a full assessment before the next session. Vorith looked at me with an expression I recognized. It was the expression of someone who was certain they were going to be proven right, and was already looking forward to it. I gathered my notes, walked back to my office, sat down at my desk, and began to read everything there was to read about the human species. By the 3rd hour, I had stopped taking breaks. By the 6th hour, I had locked my office door. By the 12th hour, I had sent a message to the council chair with a subject line I had never used in my career. It said, "We have a serious problem." The archive room had no windows. I had always liked that about it. No distractions. No view of the city outside, no passing ships, no changing light to remind you that time was moving and you were sitting still. Just the terminal, the files, and the work. That night, the lack of windows felt different. It felt like being sealed in. I had pulled every document in the galactic database tagged with the Sol system or the species designation for humans. Most of it was thin. We had been aware of Earth for roughly 200 years, primarily because their radio signals had been leaking into the galactic medium for most of that time. Not communications directed at us. Just noise. Entertainment programs, military transmissions, news broadcasts, music, arguments, sporting events, all of it radiating outward from the planet in expanding waves that our monitoring stations had been quietly collecting for decades. Nobody had paid much attention. Pre-contact species emit signals all the time. Most of it is background clutter. The humans had been filed under monitoring, routine and largely forgotten. Now I was reading 200 years of collected human transmissions, and I was not finding background clutter. The first thing I did was pull the conflict records. I wanted to understand what that 93% figure actually looked like in practice. Numbers are one thing. Details are another. The human historical record, even filtered through the limited translations we had managed, was staggering in its density of organized conflict. Not small disputes between neighboring communities, though those existed too, but large, coordinated, sustained campaigns involving millions of individuals, spanning years and sometimes decades, across entire continents. They had fought each other with every technology available to them at any given moment in history, and as their technology improved, so did the scale and efficiency of the conflict. What stopped me, though, was not the scale. Species fight. That is not unusual. What stopped me was the pattern. In most species' historical records, conflict tends to decrease as civilization matures. The logic is straightforward. As a species develops better communication, stronger institutions, and greater shared prosperity, the incentives for organized violence diminish. We see this across hundreds of documented civilizations. Early history is often turbulent. Later history tends toward stability. It is one of the markers we use to assess a species' readiness for galactic contact. In the human record, the pattern was reversed. Their conflicts did not decrease as their civilization advanced. They grew. The more sophisticated their society became, the larger and more organized their conflicts. Their two most destructive wars, events they referred to as world wars, occurred not in their primitive past but within the last 2 centuries of their development, at a point when they already had global communication networks, advanced medicine, and industrial production on a massive scale. They brought all of that capability to bear on the business of fighting each other, and the results were, by any measure, extraordinary. I found myself reading the records of those 2 conflicts in a state that I can only describe as quiet alarm. The numbers were enormous. Tens of millions of casualties in each. Industrial production redirected entirely toward military output. Agricultural systems restructured to support armies. Every facet of their society mobilized, coordinated, and directed toward a single purpose with an efficiency that was, objectively, impressive. And then, when the conflicts ended, they rebuilt. Faster than seemed possible. Within years, not generations. Cities that had been leveled were reconstructed. Economies that had been gutted were restored. Populations that had been devastated began to grow again. They did not collapse after their great wars. They recovered, reorganized, and resumed. I noted this in my file and kept reading. The fringe trader reports were scattered and inconsistent, but several of them contained direct observations of humans that I found more informative than any statistics. One report, filed by a Savari merchant who had made contact with humans at a station in the outer system, described them as, and I am quoting directly here, friendly but watchful, with a physical intensity that is difficult to explain. They smile easily. They are quick to make conversation. But there is something behind the eyes that does not match the smile. I could not determine if they were relaxed or simply appeared relaxed. Another merchant, a Dravasi who had spent a full rotation cycle aboard a shared trading post with a small human crew, wrote a more detailed account. The humans ate together constantly and appeared to use meal times as a form of social bonding. They were physically demonstrative with those they trusted, exchanging contact gestures frequently. They were highly curious about everything, asking questions about Dravasi culture, biology, and history with an enthusiasm that the merchant found both flattering and faintly unnerving. They also, the merchant noted, responded to perceived threats with a speed that was startling. During a minor equipment failure that briefly threatened the station's oxygen cycling, the human crew had moved to address the problem before the alarms had finished sounding. They did not panic. They did not freeze. They assessed and acted, and they did it with a calm that the merchant said looked almost like enjoyment. I flagged that last line and copied it into my assessment. The biology files were where things became genuinely unsettling. We had accumulated a reasonable amount of human biological data from intercepted medical transmissions and a few samples collected by our monitoring probes over the decades. The data had been reviewed by our science division and filed without particular urgency. I pulled those files now and read them properly for the first time. Humans are, by galactic standards, physically extraordinary in ways that are easy to overlook because they do not appear impressive at first glance. They are not the largest species we have catalogued. They are not the fastest. They do not have natural armor or particularly powerful natural weapons. What they have is something subtler and considerably more alarming. They experience pain. This is not unusual. Most species with a developed nervous system experience pain. Pain is a signal. It tells the organism that something is wrong and that action is required to prevent further damage. In most species, severe pain produces a strong drive to withdraw from the source of that pain and seek safety. This is useful. This keeps individuals alive. In humans, this response is overridable. Under what their biology identifies as extreme stress, the human body releases chemical compounds that effectively suppress the pain response. Not eliminate it, but suppress it enough that the individual can continue functioning at high physical capacity despite injuries that would, in most other circumstances, prevent movement entirely. Their own biology gives them a mechanism for continuing to operate through damage. They do not have to choose to push through pain. Their bodies give them the option automatically. I found the first reference to this in a human medical text, and I checked it against 3 other sources before I accepted it as accurate. Then I sat with it for a while. Consider what this means in a military context. An opponent who cannot be stopped by injury in the way that most opponents can be stopped. An opponent whose body is, in crisis moments, chemically redirected toward continued action rather than withdrawal. An opponent who, on a neurological level, is partially designed for exactly this kind of situation. Their healing rates added another layer. Humans recover from injuries at a pace that our medical files describe as remarkable for an unmodified biological organism. Not instantly. Not supernaturally. But significantly faster than most comparable species, particularly for soft tissue damage. They also adapt. Exposure to physical stress over time makes them more capable of handling physical stress. They train deliberately to increase this effect, pushing their bodies repeatedly to points of near failure in order to build greater resilience. They do this voluntarily, as a routine part of their lives, and consider it normal. There was a concept in their physical training culture that I found impossible to translate cleanly into any other language. It referred to a mental state in which the individual continues to perform physical tasks long after their body has indicated that it is no longer capable of doing so. The closest translation I could manage was something like the refusal of ending, but that does not fully capture it because it implies a dramatic act of will, and the human texts that described this state suggested it was something that could be trained into habit. Not heroism. Habit. I took a break at this point, got a cup of warm liquid from the dispenser in the hallway, and stood in the corridor for 6 minutes. Then I went back to my desk and kept reading. The cultural materials were the longest section and in many ways the most revealing. Humans produce extraordinary quantities of creative material, stories, visual representations, music, recorded performance, and I spent several hours working through translated samples trying to understand what it told me about how they see themselves and the world. A pattern emerged that I had not expected. A significant portion of human storytelling is concerned with scenarios in which humans face overwhelming odds and survive through a combination of cleverness, determination, and what I can only describe as a refusal to accept the logic of the situation. These stories are not fringe products consumed by a small subculture. They are among the most widely produced and consumed in their entire culture. They celebrate, repeatedly and enthusiastically, the individual or small group who should not have won but did. What made this remarkable was not the stories themselves. Many species tell stories about triumph against difficulty. What was remarkable was the emotional valence. Human audiences do not simply appreciate these stories. They are physically moved by them. Their bodies respond. The concept of the underdog, of the smaller force overcoming the larger one through determination alone, produces in humans a physiological reaction that their texts describe as deeply satisfying, almost necessary. They do not just enjoy stories about winning against impossible odds. They appear to need them. They have built an entire emotional infrastructure around the belief that such outcomes are possible, and they have been feeding that infrastructure stories since the beginning of their recorded culture. I noted this carefully. At the 22nd hour, I called my colleague Pynal, a species analyst who had spent several years working on pre-contact civilizations. I trusted his judgment. I explained, briefly, what I was finding. There was a pause on the line. "Have you gotten to the part about nuclear weapons yet?" he said. "Yes," I said. "They built those," he said, while they were still arguing with each other about whether the other continents on their planet were inhabited by real people. Another pause. "They built them," he continued, "and then they did not use them on each other. They came right up to the edge. Several times. And they stopped." I had read about that too. The near events, the moments where the weapons had almost been deployed and had not been, through a combination of protocol, communication, last-moment decisions, and on at least one recorded occasion, a single individual who had the authority to trigger a launch and chose not to, despite every system around him indicating that an attack was incoming. "The restraint is interesting," I said. "The restraint is terrifying," Pynal said. "Because it means they are not impulsive. They have the capacity for those weapons. They have had it for a long time. And they have chosen, deliberately, not to use it on each other, even at moments of extreme provocation. That is not weakness. That is control." I thought about that after I ended the call. Control is more dangerous than impulse. Impulse burns itself out. Control can wait. I filed 5 pages of preliminary notes to the council chair at the 31st hour. Then I pulled up the section of the human database I had been saving, not quite ready to face it until I had the rest of the picture in place. They're fiction. They're invented stories about what they would do if a species exactly like us showed up at their door. There were hundreds of them. Thousands, if you counted all the variations. Stories, films, written narratives, interactive experiences, all exploring the same fundamental scenario: contact with an extraterrestrial species, frequently hostile, and the human response. I read them for 3 hours. The humans won, in the vast majority of these stories. Not always easily. Not always without great cost. But they won. And the methods they used, in story after story, were not simply superior technology or greater numbers. They won through adaptability. Through finding unexpected solutions to problems that seemed to have no solution. Through continuing to function and fight in circumstances where any logical analysis would suggest they should stop. They had been imagining this moment for generations. They had been thinking about how to respond to exactly this for longer than the Krethkai had been thinking about whether to do it. I closed the files at the 36th hour. My assessment was ready. I formatted it, checked it twice, and sent it to the 5 most senior members of the council with a subject line that read, "Read this before you vote." The full document was 47 pages long. The first response came back in 4 minutes. It was from Councillor Adrian of the Savari delegation, who was 90 years my senior and had seen more of the galaxy than almost anyone alive. It said, "I have read the first 12 pages. I need to take a short walk. I will read the rest when my legs stop feeling strange." The second response, from Councillor Brev of the Thalkori delegation, arrived 20 minutes later. It was a single line. It said, "Where did we park our fleet?" The chamber held 412 seats. Every one of them was filled. This had never happened in my time at the council. Not once. Not for border disputes that had lasted decades, not for famine emergencies, not for the vote on the Dravasi Relocation Treaty, which had at the time been considered the most significant political event in living memory. 412 seats, filled to capacity, before the opening bell had sounded. I stood at the archivist's bench and counted them. Not because the number mattered. I just needed something to do with my hands while I organized the notes on my terminal and tried to appear as though I was not aware that everyone in the room was going to spend the next several hours watching me. The council chair, Prelin, arrived precisely on time. She looked at the full chamber, looked at me, and gave me a small nod that I interpreted as both acknowledgement and warning. She had read my full assessment. She had contacted me at the 44th hour to ask 3 questions, all of them sharp, all of them focused on the parts of my report she had clearly found most difficult to accept. I had answered them honestly. She had ended the call without comment. Now she sat at the head of the chamber and called the session to order, and her voice was even and calm, the way the voice of someone who has been running difficult meetings for 60 years tends to be. The purpose of this session, she said, is the review of the full threat assessment compiled by Senior Archivist Vex AAL regarding the proposed operation against Sol 3. The Krethkai proposal is suspended pending this review. Archivist Vex AAL has the floor. Vorith was in his usual seat. He had brought 6 delegates this time. He was not looking at me. He was looking at the chamber, counting the attendees the way I had, and I could see from the slight shift in his posture that the full house had not been part of his expectations. I stood up. I will need approximately 90 minutes, I said. I ask for silence and for patience. Some of what I am going to present will seem excessive. I am asking you to reserve that judgment until I have finished. Nobody objected. I took a breath and began. I want to start with something that is not in my written report, I said. In 312 years of archival work, I have assessed potential threats from 41 species. In every case, the threat assessment was a formality. The technology comparisons were unfavorable for the subject species, the military capacity was insufficient, and the evaluation was concluded quickly. In every case, I signed off on the assessment within a cycle or 2. I spent 38 hours on this one. I want you to understand what that means before I show you the data. The chamber was quiet. I turned to my display screen and brought up the first image, a map of Earth, covered in red markings indicating recorded areas of major organized conflict over the last 5,000 years. The map was almost entirely red. I gave them 10 seconds to look at it before I spoke. Humans have been in a documented state of large-scale conflict for approximately 93% of their recorded history. I want to be precise about what this means. This is not continuous warfare across the entire planet simultaneously. It means that at any given moment in the last 5,000 years of human records, there has almost certainly been an organized large-scale conflict occurring somewhere on their world. It has been the default condition of their civilization, not the exception. I watched the delegations. Most of them were still looking at the map. A few were writing notes. The Krethkai section was carefully neutral. I want to be clear that I am not presenting this as evidence of savagery, I continued. I am presenting it as evidence of sustained organizational capability. Maintaining large-scale organized conflict requires logistics, communication, resource management, discipline, and coordination. These are not the skills of a primitive species. These are the skills of a species that has been practicing complex coordinated operations for 5,000 years and has become extremely good at it. I moved to the next image. A timeline of human technological development, with major conflict events marked alongside major technological advances. Their 2 largest conflicts occurred here, I said, indicating the last 2 centuries of their timeline. At the point in their development where they had achieved global communication networks, industrial manufacturing at continental scale, and coordinated economic systems. They applied all of that infrastructure to the conflicts. What resulted was, in terms of organizational efficiency and destructive output, genuinely remarkable. Not because of the destruction itself, which I understand is not a value we celebrate, but because the organizational achievement it represents tells us something important about what this species can do when it is motivated and unified. Counselor Adrian raised a hand. I nodded. You said, when unified, she said. The historical record suggests humans are frequently in conflict with each other. How unified are they, in practice? A good question, I said. And the honest answer is that they are not particularly unified under normal conditions. They are divided by geography, culture, language, and a number of identity categories that I will not attempt to summarize here. Under normal conditions, their divisions are significant and real. But there is a pattern in their history that I need you to understand. I brought up a new display. A list of historical events in which external pressure had caused previously divided human groups to cooperate. Every time humans have faced an external threat that they perceived as targeting all of them, the internal divisions have compressed. Not vanished, but compressed significantly and quickly. Their history contains multiple examples of groups that had been in active conflict with each other within years of the external threat arising, and then setting that conflict aside to address the external threat together. They did not forget their internal disagreements. They filed them for later and turned outward. I let that sit for a moment. An invasion from space, I said, would be the most unambiguous external threat in human history. It would be targeting all of them, visibly and undeniably. There is no historical precedent for how unified they might become in response to something like that. But the pattern of their behavior under lesser external pressures suggests that the answer is considerably more unified than they are now. The Krethkai section stirred. Vorith leaned over to speak quietly to one of his colleagues. I continued. I want to address the technology gap directly, because I know it is the foundation of the Krethkai assessment. They are correct that human technology lags behind current galactic standard by a significant margin. Faster than light travel, energy-based weapons, shielding systems, advanced computing at the scales we use, they do not have these things. In a direct technological comparison, they are not competitive. I paused. However, there are 3 things I want the chamber to understand about the technology gap. I raised one finger. First, the gap is closing faster than any pre-contact species in our recorded history. In the last 100 years of human development, their technological capability has roughly doubled 7 times. They are not on a gradual development curve. They are accelerating. What this means practically is that the technology comparison we make today is not the technology comparison we would be making in 50 years, or 20 years, or possibly 10. Second finger. Second, human military doctrine does not depend entirely on technology. Their history contains hundreds of documented examples of smaller, less technologically advanced forces defeating larger, more technologically advanced ones. They have developed extensive tactical and strategic frameworks for this exact situation. These frameworks are refined and detailed. They are not theoretical. They have been tested under conditions of genuine high pressure and have produced results. The humans call this kind of thinking adaptive strategy. I would call it practicing how to fight opponents who are better armed than they are, for 5,000 years. Third finger. Third, and most importantly, the question of technology is somewhat secondary to the question of what they are willing to do. Technology can be overcome. Capability can be matched or countered. Willingness is a different matter. I brought up the next display. A series of documented historical events, each with a brief summary. These are selected incidents from human military history in which human forces continued to resist after sustaining losses that, by any conventional military analysis, should have ended the engagement. In each of these cases, the side that should have stopped did not stop. In the majority of these cases, the side that should have stopped eventually won, or at minimum prevented the other side from achieving its objectives, purely by refusing to accept the outcome that the tactical situation seemed to guarantee. I looked at the room. This is not a feature of a small subset of their military culture. It is a documented pattern across multiple civilizations, multiple time periods, and multiple types of conflict. The humans have a word for it that translates roughly as holding the line. They have songs about it. They have monuments to it. They teach it to their children as a virtue. The refusal to accept a losing position as final is not an occasional anomaly in their history. It is one of their organizing principles. The chamber was very quiet. I want to address the biological data now, I said, and brought up the next set of files. I walked them through the physiology. The pain suppression response under extreme stress. The healing rates. The physical adaptability. The documented cases of human individuals continuing to function and act under injury levels that our medical protocols would classify as incapacitating. I did not dramatize this. I presented the data. I let it speak. Then I pulled up the section on human psychology that I had spent the longest time on. The most significant thing I found in the behavioral data, I said, is something that is difficult to quantify but easy to observe in their recorded material. Humans form very strong attachments to the groups they belong to. This is not unusual. What is unusual is what happens to those attachments under pressure. In most species, group attachments weaken under sustained external threat as individuals prioritize personal survival. In humans, the pattern is frequently inverted. The attachments intensify. The group becomes more important to the individual, not less, as the danger increases. This produces a feedback loop in which the more threatened the group becomes, the more motivated each individual member is to protect it, the more effective the group becomes at collective action, and the harder it becomes to defeat through attrition. Counselor Brev of the Thalkori delegation, a quiet individual who rarely spoke during open session, raised a hand. "Are you saying," he said carefully, "that the act of attacking them would make them harder to defeat?" "Yes," I said. "That is precisely what the behavioral data suggests." The silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before it. It was heavier. Voreth spoke from his seat without raising his hand, which was technically out of order but which Prelin did not move to correct, because the question was too relevant to delay. "Archivist," he said, and his voice had lost some of the confidence it had carried in the previous session, "you are describing a species with no faster-than-light travel, no energy weapons, no shielding technology, and significantly lower military hardware capability than our own forces. Against that, you are weighing behavioral tendencies and historical patterns. Are we genuinely being asked to withdraw a legitimate resource acquisition proposal because of the psychological profiles of a pre-contact species?" I looked at him. "I am asking the chamber to consider," I said, "what happens when a fleet of our most advanced warships arrives in orbit around a world of 8 billion beings who have been preparing, culturally and psychologically, for exactly this moment for their entire recorded history. Who will not panic? Who will not fracture? Who will look at the ships in their sky and immediately begin calculating how to bring them down? Who have more experience with sustained organized conflict than any species currently represented in this chamber? Who have a neurological response to threat that makes them more dangerous, not less? And who will not, based on 5,000 years of documented behavior, stop?" I looked around the room. "I am not saying they would win," I said. "I am saying I genuinely do not know that they would lose. And I am saying that the Krethkai intelligence report, which ran to 3 paragraphs, did not ask this question at all. The vote that afternoon was not on the Krethkai proposal. It was on my recommendation for a full suspension of any action against the Sol system pending a comprehensive review. The result was 31 votes in favor and 2 opposed. Voreth was the last to leave the chamber. He passed my bench on the way out without stopping. But he looked at me, just briefly. He was no longer looking tolerant. He was looking thoughtful. That was, in its own way, more interesting. I sat down, collected my notes, and began drafting the communication I had been composing in my mind since the 32nd hour of my research, a carefully worded, deeply cautious, first contact signal directed at Sol 3. I chose my words very carefully. The signal took 11 days to reach Earth. The reply took 11 days to come back. 22 days of waiting, during which I drafted 17 versions of my follow-up communication and discarded all of them, wrote a secondary threat assessment addendum that I did not submit because it contained 4 pages of speculation and no verifiable data, and drank more warm liquid than I had consumed in the previous 5 years combined. The reply, when it arrived, was not what I expected. I had expected confusion. I had expected, at minimum, some indication of the shock that first confirmed contact with an extraterrestrial civilization should produce in a species that had not yet left their own solar system in any meaningful capacity. The human transmissions we had been monitoring for decades contained considerable material about the concept of extraterrestrial contact, and the general tone of that material suggested that the moment of confirmation would be treated as a civilization-defining event of enormous emotional weight. What I received was a polite, composed, and extremely well-organized response in 3 languages, followed by a request for clarification on 4 specific points in my signal, followed by a formal offer of a meeting at a location of our choosing. They had already picked a backup location, in case we declined the first one. I stared at the reply for a long time. Then I forwarded it to Prelin with a note that said, they were ready for this. I do not mean ready as in prepared emotionally. I mean ready as in they had procedures. Prelin's response was brief: choose a neutral station and send them coordinates. I want this meeting to happen before Voreth finds a procedural angle to restart his proposal. I understood the urgency. The Krethkai had been quiet since the chamber session, which in council politics usually meant they were regrouping rather than retreating. Voreth had requested 3 separate archive reviews in the past week, all of them focused on the legal statutes governing pre-contact species. He was looking for something. I did not know what yet, but I intended to find it before he did. In the meantime, there was the matter of who humanity was going to send. The answer arrived in the 6th communication, a detailed message that included, among other things, the credentials and biographical summary of their chosen representative. Her name was Dr. Lena Hartley. She held advanced qualifications in what the humans called xenolinguistics and comparative cultural theory, which were disciplines they had apparently developed in anticipation of exactly this kind of contact. She had also, the biographical note mentioned almost as an aside, served for 9 years in one of Earth's larger military organizations before leaving to pursue her academic work. I read the biographical note 3 times. Then I called Pyrnal. They sent a linguist, I said. That makes sense, he said. First contact is a language problem. She spent 9 years in their military, I said. A pause. Right, he said. So she is a linguist who knows how to think under pressure, make decisions with incomplete information, and function in environments where the wrong move has serious consequences. And they dressed her up as a diplomat. I think she may actually be a diplomat, I said. Vexaal, he said, the humans sent you exactly the kind of person you would send if you were very good at first contact and also wanted to make sure the person you sent could handle it if the first contact went badly. That is not an accident. That is a deliberate choice. I thought about the fiction files I had spent 3 hours reading. All those stories about contact scenarios. All that cultural preparation. They have been thinking about this for a very long time, I said. Yes, he said. And apparently they have been training for it. The neutral station I selected was a small transit facility called Auros 7, positioned at a comfortable distance from both Earth and the Krethkai home system, technically under council jurisdiction but minimally staffed, with no political allegiances that would complicate things. I sent the coordinates. The humans confirmed within a day. I began making travel arrangements, because Prelin had decided, after some deliberation, that I was the most logical choice to conduct the initial meeting. I want to be honest about how I felt during the journey to Auros 7. I have traveled on diplomatic assignments before. I have attended meetings with species that were technically at war with each other. I have delivered news that no one wanted to hear. None of those experiences produced the particular quality of alertness that I felt during those 14 hours of transit. Not fear. I was not afraid. It was something closer to the feeling you get when you step into a room and realize it is much larger inside than it appeared from the outside. Dr. Hartley arrived 4 hours after I did, on a vessel that the humans had apparently modified significantly from its original configuration, which our monitoring probes had previously assessed as a long-range research ship. What arrived at Auros 7 was still technically a research ship. It was also, very visibly, faster than it had been. Whatever they had done to the drive system in the months since we had last logged a close observation, they had done it quickly and effectively. I noted this in my travel log and went to the docking bay to meet her. She was shorter than I had expected from the biological data. Humans have a range of physical proportions and I had apparently been working from a mid-range estimate. She was also, I realized immediately, younger than her credentials had implied. Not young by human standards, perhaps, but there was something about the way she moved and stood that suggested energy held in reserve rather than expended. She was wearing practical clothes in a dark color. She carried a single bag. She looked at me with the same calm expression that the trader had described years ago in that fringe station report, warm but watchful, relaxed in a way that did not quite match whatever was behind the eyes. She greeted me in our language. The pronunciation was not perfect but it was functional, which meant she had spent at least several months on the problem and had found it solvable. Given that our language had not been publicly available to her until 22 days ago, this was, I found myself thinking, extremely interesting. Archivist Vexaal, she said. Thank you for reaching out. I appreciate that you chose a comfortable distance. It suggests good faith. I hope it does, I said. Did you have a comfortable journey? We had a very fast journey, she said. We made some modifications. I noticed, I said. She looked at me with what I would later understand was a human expression of amusement that stops just short of becoming a smile. We like to be prepared, she said. We ate together, which was her suggestion. She had brought food from Earth and laid out an arrangement on the station's small conference table that was clearly a deliberate act of cultural sharing rather than simple practicality. She was precise about offering things without pressuring, explaining what each item was and where it came from with the ease of someone who had done exactly this kind of introduction many times before in different contexts. Within 20 minutes, she knew what the crisis was. I had not told her directly. I had been carefully vague in all my communications about the specific political situation. But she had read the signal I sent, she had read our 22 days of exchange, she had thought about what would cause an archival institution to initiate first contact outside of standard protocol, and she had worked it out. Someone wants to move against Earth, she said. Not a question. She said it with the same tone you might use to identify a familiar road on an unfamiliar map. Calm recognition. There is a proposal before the Council, I said carefully. It has been suspended pending review. The situation is being handled through proper channels. Right, she said. But you did not reach out because the situation was comfortably under control through proper channels. She looked at me with complete steadiness. Who is it? I explained. I gave her the broad outline of the Krethkai proposal, the legal framework they were exploiting, the 3-paragraph intelligence assessment, the vote, the suspension, and the current political situation, including my concerns about Voritha's ongoing archive research. I gave her all of this in approximately 40 minutes, speaking carefully, and she listened without interrupting. She asked 2 questions during that time, both of them sharp and specific, focused on the parts of the story that had the most immediate practical implications. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked for a full briefing on Krethkai military structure. Not an overview. A full briefing. Fleet disposition, command hierarchy, supply chain logistics, standard tactical doctrine, their record against other species in previous engagements, and the names and profiles of their senior operational commanders. I looked at her. May I ask, I said, why specifically? She smiled then. A real one. Because I like to understand the situation I'm walking into, she said. Fully. I provided the briefing. She absorbed it over the following 2 hours with a focus that I found difficult to describe. It was not the focus of someone memorizing information. It was the focus of someone processing information, turning it over, looking at it from different angles, testing it against other things they knew. She interrupted 4 times to ask clarifying questions. Once, she asked me to repeat a detail about Krethkai fleet formation doctrine, then was quiet for almost a full minute before nodding slightly to herself and moving on. Toward the end of the 2nd hour, as I was finishing the section on Krethkai supply chain vulnerability, she picked up a writing instrument she had brought with her and drew something on a small piece of paper. I could see it from where I sat, a diagram of some kind, lines and notations, organized in a structure that I did not recognize. What is that? I asked. She turned it toward me briefly. It was a tactical diagram. It showed the Krethkai fleet in standard patrol formation, with a series of annotations marking specific points in the formation where, apparently, a well-timed disruption would have cascading effects on their operational coherence. It was not a vague sketch. It was specific. It was detailed. It referenced real data from the briefing I had just given her, cross-referenced with what I could only assume were strategic principles she had brought with her from her own background. She had drawn it in the time it had taken me to finish one section of a briefing she had received for the first time 2 hours ago. She folded the paper and put it in her bag. Just understanding the situation, she said. I sat back in my chair and looked at her with what I hoped was a neutral expression. Dr. Hartley, I said. I am going to ask you something, and I would appreciate an honest answer. Of course, she said. Are you concerned? I asked. About the proposal. About the situation Earth is in. She considered this for a moment. No, she said simply. Not at all. Not really. She picked up one of the food items from the arrangement on the table and examined it with what appeared to be genuine interest before eating it. We knew contact was coming. We have been receiving your broadcasts for a long time, the ones you did not know we were getting. We have been having serious internal conversations about this for decades. What to do? How to respond? What we would need to be prepared for? She looked at me. We disagreed about a lot of it. Humans usually disagree. But we agreed on the general approach. Engage in good faith. Be honest about what we are. And if the good faith approach does not work, she paused. Be honest about that too. And the proposal? I said. If the council had voted in favor. She was quiet for a long moment. We would have been fine, she said. Her voice was even. She was not being aggressive. She was not posturing. She was stating something that she appeared to regard as a simple factual assessment, the way you might say the weather is cold or the station is quiet. I believed her completely. That was the part that I could not entirely account for. I had spent 48 hours reading everything there was to read about human history and psychology and biology and culture. I had presented those findings to the full Galactic Council. I had argued, in the most careful and measured language I could manage, that this species was not to be approached carelessly. And sitting across from Dr. Lena Hartley on a small transit station at the edge of explored space, watching her fold a tactical diagram she had produced in 2 hours of briefing and tuck it into her bag with complete calm, I understood with total clarity that all of my research had not fully prepared me for the actual experience of being in the same room as one of them. I have to take you to the council, I said. I know, she said. What is the political situation like going in? I gave her the assessment honestly. Prelin's cautious support, the swing votes that were still undecided, the Krethkai delegation's quiet persistence, the legal angles Voreth was still exploring. She listened to all of it. Nodded once. Then looked at me with an expression I could not quite categorize. Is Voreth the one running the briefing schedule and picking the session times? She asked. He has had some input, I said carefully. Okay, she said. When we get there, I want to speak in open session. Not a private meeting. Open chamber, full attendance. Can you arrange that? I can recommend it to the chair, I said. Good, she said. I want everybody in the room. She said it the way a person says something when they have already thought it through and arrived at a conclusion and are simply communicating the result. No drama. No hesitation. I sent a message to Prelin on the journey back. I told her that the human representative had agreed to address the council in open session and that I strongly recommended granting the request. I also told her, in a separate line, that I thought she should read the fringe trader reports again before the session, specifically the part about the expression behind the eyes that does not quite match the smile. Prelin responded, understood. I will set the chamber for full attendance. I looked out the small viewport of the transit vessel at the stars beyond and thought about Dr. Hartley sitting in the cabin behind me, probably working through files of her own. Whatever happened next, I was certain of one thing. The Krethkai had done their research on human technology and stopped there. They had looked at the hardware and seen a gap and called it an answer. They had not looked at the people. I had looked at the people. And I had brought one of them here. I was beginning to suspect that this was going to be one of the most important decisions of my career. I was also beginning to suspect that it was going to be fine. Not because I had made the right call, but because of the quiet certainty of the person sitting behind me in that cabin, doing her homework before walking into a room full of the most powerful political figures in the known galaxy. She had drawn a tactical diagram from memory in 2 hours. She had folded it up and put it in her pocket. She had said she was just curious. Curious is a very human word. I was learning, slowly, that it covered a great deal of ground. The chamber held 412 seats and every single one of them was full again. I counted without meaning to. Old habit. Prelin had cleared the session calendar entirely. This was the only item of the day. When a human representative was going to address the Galactic High Council for the first time in recorded history, apparently every delegation decided that everything else could wait. I noticed representatives from species that had not sent delegates to a general session in 8 or 9 years. I noticed 3 counselors who I was fairly certain had been listed as retired. I noticed, in a side observation box that was technically reserved for legal staff, an entire Krethkai auxiliary team that had arrived with Voreth and his expanded delegation, now numbering 9. 9, for a species that considered 2 their standard diplomatic complement. I noted this quietly and returned to my preparation. Dr. Hartley was not in the chamber yet. She had arrived at the council facility 2 hours before the session and spent most of that time in a small room I had arranged for her, reviewing files, eating something she had brought herself, and, when I checked in at the 1-hour mark, apparently sitting quietly with her eyes closed in a way that I initially interpreted as sleep and then recognized, from the steadiness of her posture, as something more deliberate. She opened her eyes when I entered and looked at me with complete alertness. "How are you feeling?" I asked, because it seemed like the appropriate thing to ask. "Ready," she said. One word. No elaboration. I had spent the previous 48 hours preparing her. Not coaching. She had not needed coaching. What she had needed was information, and I had given her everything I could access: the political dynamics of every major delegation, the specific concerns of the swing votes, the legal arguments Voritha's team had been constructing, the list of topics that were most likely to come up in open questioning, and my own honest assessment of what the room would be looking for from her. She had received all of this with focused attention and asked precise follow-up questions that were always aimed at the operational heart of whatever I had just told her. Not the background. Not the history. The practical, immediate, what does this mean for what happens next center of each piece of information. After 2 days of working with her, I had developed a strong respect for the quality of her attention and a quiet appreciation for the fact that she was on the side of the conversation she was on. She had also, at some point in the last 48 hours, obtained a complete translation of the Krethkai legal brief that Voritha's team had filed on the second day after our return. I did not know how she had obtained it. I had not given it to her. When I asked, she told me she had requested it through the standard council public record access system, which was, technically, open to any registered visitor to the facility. The brief was 80 pages long. She had read it in one sitting and produced a 6-page response document that she handed to me the following morning with a request that I review it before forwarding it to Prelin. I read it. Then I read it again. Then I found Pyrnal and made him read it over my shoulder. The document systematically dismantled every legal argument in the Krethkai brief using the Krethkai's own cited precedents, 3 council statutes that Voritha's team had either overlooked or chosen to ignore, and 1 treaty from roughly 140 years ago that I had personally helped archive and had completely forgotten existed until I saw it cited in her document with a precision that suggested she had found it, read it, understood it, and identified its relevance in the time it had taken me to get breakfast. Pyrnal finished reading and looked at me. "She is a linguist," he said. "Yes," I said. "Who was in the military for 9 years." "Yes," I said. "And apparently also a lawyer." "Apparently," I said. I forwarded the document to Prelin, who responded within 20 minutes with 2 words: "Send her in." The session opened on the 7th bell. Prelin called the room to order with her customary efficiency and gave a brief introduction that was admirably neutral. The Galactic High Council was receiving its first formal address from a representative of the species designated Sol 3, in the context of the ongoing review of the suspended Krethkai proposal, and all protocols regarding first contact addresses were in effect, meaning that the speaker would not be interrupted until she indicated that she had completed her address. Then she nodded to me. I walked to the door at the side of the chamber and opened it. Dr. Hartley walked in. She was wearing dark clothing again, practical and neat. She carried nothing. She walked to the speaking position at the center of the chamber floor without hesitation, without looking around the room with the wide-eyed response that anyone might be forgiven for having when entering a 400-seat galactic legislative chamber for the first time in their life, and she turned to face the assembled delegations of every species in the known galaxy. She stood still for exactly 3 seconds. Not from nerves. I recognized this from the behavioral data. It was a human technique for establishing presence before speaking, taking enough space and silence to indicate that what came next was worth waiting for. Then she began. "My name is Lena Hartley," she said. Her voice carried without effort, clear and even. "I come from a planet called Earth. You know it by the designation Sol 3. I am here because your archivist reached out to us, and we appreciated that. I am also here because I understand that there is a proposal on this council's agenda that concerns my world directly, and I would like to speak to that." The room was absolutely silent. "I am going to be straightforward with you," she said. "Earth has known about you for a long time. Not all of you. Not specifically. But we have been aware, for decades, that we are not alone, that there are others in this galaxy, and that contact of some kind was likely. We have been having a conversation among ourselves about what that contact should look like and how to approach it. That conversation has not always been easy. We do not always agree. But we arrived at a general position that I think is worth sharing. She paused, just briefly. We want to engage. We want to be part of the galactic community. We have things to offer and things to learn, and we understand that participation in something larger than ourselves requires compromise, relationship, and mutual respect. We are genuinely interested in that. This is not a performance. We have been looking at your stars for our entire history and wondering, and now we know, and our answer is yes. We want to be here. Something moved in the room. Not quite a sound. More like a collective shift in attention. But, she said, and her voice did not change volume or tone, but something in it became very precise, the way a blade becomes precise when you hold it at a particular angle to the light. I want to be equally straightforward about something else. She looked around the chamber slowly. Not theatrically. Methodically. She was meeting eyes, or the nearest equivalent for each species represented, with the calm deliberateness of someone taking inventory. I have read the Krethkai proposal, she said. I have read their intelligence assessment, which I understand ran to 3 paragraphs. I have also read their legal brief, which is considerably longer and considerably more carefully constructed, and I want to address that briefly before I address the larger question. She produced a single sheet of paper from a pocket and held it up. There are 4 precedents cited in the Krethkai brief that are being used to argue that Earth's pre-contact status removes protections under Council statutes. Those 4 precedents were all established under conditions that are legally distinct from Earth's current situation in ways that their brief does not acknowledge. Specifically, 2 of them predate the 7th revision of the Contact Protocol framework, which introduced new language specifically designed to close the gap they are exploiting. One of them was applied to a species that had no documented interstellar communication capability, which Earth does have, by virtue of the fact that I am standing in this room. And one of them, the Dravasi secondary case, was explicitly overturned on appeal 14 years after it was issued, which I found in the archived records that your archivist very helpfully made accessible through the public system. She put the paper back in her pocket. I am not a lawyer by training, she said. But I have read the brief carefully, and I believe the legal foundation for the proposed operation is not as solid as it appears. I am happy to provide a written analysis to the Council's legal division if that would be useful. Voritha's section was very still. Now, she said, and she shifted her weight slightly, a small adjustment that somehow changed the entire quality of her presence at the center of the room. I want to talk about the larger question. Not the legal one. The practical one. The one that I think is the actual heart of this. She looked toward the Krethkai delegation directly. Not aggressively. Just clearly. You want resources that are on or near Earth. I understand that. Resources are finite and competition for them is real, and I am not going to pretend that this is not a legitimate issue. What I want to offer you is a different way to think about how to get them. She turned back to face the full chamber. Earth has had this conversation before. Among ourselves. In a different form. We have had neighbors who had things we wanted, and we have, historically, tried various approaches to getting them. We have tried taking. We have tried negotiating. We have tried building relationships that produced mutual benefit. I am going to tell you, based on our own experience, which approach produced the best long-term results. She paused. It was not the taking. We have extensive records on what happens when one group decides that another group is too weak to defend what it has, and acts on that assessment. The short-term acquisition of resources is real. I am not going to pretend otherwise. But the long-term costs are significant and they compound in ways that are difficult to anticipate from the starting position. The group being taken from does not simply absorb the loss and continue. It changes. It becomes organized around the experience of being taken from. It develops capabilities and motivations and internal cohesion that it did not have before. And eventually, the situation looks very different from how it looked at the beginning. She was not raising her voice. She was not using dramatic language. She was describing this the way you describe a fact about a system you have studied carefully, with the flat precision of someone who has seen the outcome and is explaining the mechanism. I am not standing here to threaten anyone, she said. I want to be clear about that. I am standing here to be honest, because I think honesty is more useful right now than anything else I could offer. And honestly, if the decision of this council is to authorize the Krethkai proposal, Earth will respond. We will not accept the outcome. We will not ask for quarter and we will not grant it. We will fight with everything we have for as long as we can, and we will be very creative about it, and the cost in resources and lives and political capital for everyone involved will be extremely high. I am not saying this to be frightening. I am saying this because you deserve accurate information when you are making a decision this significant. She let that settle. But that is not what I want, she said. And I do not think it is what most of you in this room want either. What I am proposing, on behalf of Earth, is something different. Membership in this council. Open trade. Shared development of the resources in question, under a framework that benefits multiple parties. We have technologies that several delegations here have already quietly expressed interest in through back channels. She smiled, just slightly. Yes, we noticed. We are not offended. We are encouraged. It suggests that the relationship can be mutually beneficial. She looked at the room. We are not an easy species, she said. I am not going to tell you that we are simple or uncomplicated or that working with us will be without friction. We are stubborn and we argue and we take a long time to build trust and we have a complicated history that sometimes makes us difficult to deal with. But we are loyal to the relationships we build. We are creative in ways that produce results that surprise even ourselves sometimes. And we are very, very good at solving problems that seem to have no solution. She stopped. She looked around the room one more time. That is what I came here to say, she said. I am available for questions. The silence lasted for 4 full seconds before the first hand went up. What followed was 2.5 hours of questions, and I watched from my bench with a particular quality of attention that I had not experienced in decades. Not all of the questions were friendly.